Hello everyone. 안녕하십니까 여러분. minasan konnichiwa. And welcome to Things Polyglots Know. Now, I opened up in English, Japanese, and Korean because what I've got today for you is something that actually is equally useful both for learners of Japanese and for learners of Korean. Though Korean learners in particular are going to have to take a couple of fairly simple extra steps that I will be describing directly. Now, if you're learning Japanese, like I imagine quite a few of you are, and somebody were to ask you what the most difficult part of the process is, I imagine a lot of you would answer kanji. And for those of you who are learning Korean, I would imagine at least some of you decided on Korean over Japanese because of the absence of kanji. Pretty much everybody finds them extremely difficult in their early stages of learning, and sometimes they're the reason people don't get past the early stages of learning. Let me just let you in on something, though. What if I were to tell you that there's a way that kanji, or hanja in Korean, or just Chinese characters if we're speaking in English, could actually make life easier for you, actually accelerate your vocabulary learning? That's what we're going to talk about today in this short study hack. This was inspired by a Twitter user who was tweeting on the langtoot, as I see it, because to me a W is a Welsh vowel. I imagine people say langtweet as well. Hashtag. By the name of Raika, who had posted a absolutely just beautifully lettered list of their vocabulary words, and I'd corrected the spelling. She'd made what was a very typical mistake even for native speakers in the spelling of the word padum, meaning pronunciation. And we'd gotten into talking about how one way that you can remember how that it is pal and not pa in Korean is to know that it breaks down into two Chinese characters, namely pal and And that blossomed into a discussion that resulted in this video, so I'd just like to thank Raika for providing me with that inspiration. So let's just stick with the word padum, or in Japanese you have the identical word that is pronounced hatsuon and also means pronunciation, or if you add hada in Korean, to pronounce, or suru in Japanese, also to pronounce. Now this breaks down into two characters. If you are learning Japanese, you probably already know what those two characters look like. If you're learning Korean, most beginner and intermediate and really even advanced textbooks that I'm familiar with don't even really bother getting into the Chinese characters, which I think is a real mistake for reasons that are going to become apparent to you. But if you go to one of the better online vocabulary terminology sources for Korean, like the Naver English Korean English Dictionary or Wiktionary, you will see the Chinese characters for a word, the hanja, put next to the respective dictionary entry. And it's important to make sure you get the right ones, because sometimes you will have one pronunciation and there will be multiple different Chinese character combinations that get you that same thing, but with totally different meanings. So that's one thing you have to be careful with, particularly in Korean, but not so much in Japanese, where you actually have the characters usually in front of you. Let's look at this word. Padum in Japanese, padum in Korean, that should be, or hatsuon in Japanese. So what's that first character there? It's read pal in Korean and hatsu in Japanese. Now, and it's also, it should be noted, this is an example of where the same character is written differently between the two languages. In fact, between Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. Because Japanese uses the traditional character. Some forms of Chinese also do. But Japanese has its own simplification. And the PRC has a totally different simplification as well. So there are multiple different ways that this character could be read, but in all cases it means departure, or the beginning of something, or sometimes the emission or the projection or the throwing of a thing. In fact, it's meant to look like somebody with a bow and arrow. So that is the first character. And then you've got or on in Japanese. And that means sound in both languages. So hatsu-on just means to emit a sound. Easy enough. That means to pronounce. Now, that might help you remember how to spell parum, but let me tell you how it actually is a gateway to learning even more related words, because you will find pal or hatsu and or on in a whole lot of different words. And I'm only going to just touch on a few examples here, just to get you started and get you thinking about this in a way that will really help you increase your Japanese or Korean vocabulary in a real hurry. Now, sometimes these words are spelt and pronounced differently in Northern and Southern Korean, so I'm going to give both of them, since you might encounter both in the wild. So, although this isn't as much of an issue with pal, because it doesn't actually touch on any of the differential spelling rules between the North and the South. So let me give you a few examples of other related words with this pal or hatsu. The first of which is palsa, or in Japanese, hassha. Palsa, hassha. Now, you could see that as a noun, which is where it would just be palsa or hassha, or as a verb, palsa hada, hassha suru. In both cases, we have the character again, pal or hatsu, meaning like emission or departure or beginning of something, and sha in Japanese, or tsa in Korean, which means a vehicle. It kind of looks like a wagon as well. Now, palsahada, or hassha suru, means for a vehicle to depart. In fact, the last time I was in Japan, which admittedly is now quite a long time ago, every time a train would depart, you would hear the electronic voice say, hassha shimasu. We're departing now. So, that's one example. Another one is 발견,発見. 발견,発見. And this is composed of 발, which we've already met, and gyon, or ken, which we're just getting to know, and it means to see. The act of seeing, or sight. And so, 발견, and this is another one that can be both a noun or a verb. If you add hada or suru to it, depending on whether you're speaking Korean or Japanese, it becomes the verb. And if you don't, then it's just the noun. And what we have here is the beginning of something, or the departure, and sight, meaning to discover as a verb, or discovery. And see, the results of this is you're already, in addition to the character you already kind of picked up for parum or hatsuo, meaning pronunciation, you've already picked up two more characters that you can then go on and you will see other places. And it will give you a bit of a heads up on what those words that you see them in might mean. Now, let's move on to the second character in parum. Or in Japanese, on, which just means sound. Now you see this one quite a lot. The word that you will be most familiar with that it's in is umak, or ongaku, which means music. Now that is sound plus pleasure. Ak, or gaku. It is also sometimes read raku in Japanese, and actually rak or nak in Korean. Rak being the northern reading and nak being the southern reading. Now, so sound pleasure, ak ongaku is music. Similarly, another term that you will probably see in and comes up fairly often is rogum, or nogum in the south, or rokuon, which means to record audio. Then Japanese and Korean, when you say to record something, it distinguishes between audio and video. So if you're recording audio, it is rogum or nogum, or rokuon in Japanese. And again, this is one that you can add suru in Japanese or hada in Korean too, and it becomes a verb. So it can be audio recording or to record audio. Now to record video, on the other hand, is rokwa or nokwa or rokuga. Now we've met rok or nok, or in Japanese roku, and that means to like record something or a record, anything like that. Meanwhile, this hua or ga and this is another one where you have a different character in Japanese versus Korean because of simplification, which Korean doesn't do. It means picture. So, no or ro, hua, record picture. Roku ga, record picture. So, see, it's sort of a gate. Noticing these Chinese characters in these words and looking up the meanings of them is really sort of a gateway drug to more vocabulary. Because each time that you find one of these characters that you know in a new context, it's an opportunity to find out about another character that you didn't already know. And that is another way, is a gateway to more characters that you don't know. And suddenly you are just sort of picking this stuff up randomly. It makes vocabulary learning potentially very easy. Now, another example to give you of or on, meaning sound again, is jabum. Jabum. Or in Japanese, zatsuon. Zatsuon. Now that is jap or zatsu, which means just sort of miscellaneous, random, a whole bunch of stuff jumbled together. And sound, which we've already met. So I'm just giving you these few examples because this is just a quick tip, but you will find that you can do this all over the place. Now I should give you one little caution for Korean learners in this. You will find pal and in words that have absolutely nothing to do with these Chinese characters. Because in Korean, of course, you may already know, turns a word into an abstract noun. And pal can mean foot. So in fact, there's a word that puts both of them in there, and it has nothing to do with either of them. Palgorum. Pal meaning foot, gorum meaning step, or the act of walking. So that pal is nothing to do with padum, and that is nothing to do with padum. Sometimes you will get this. Now in Japanese you get this too, but you already are being shown the character, so it's easy to realize and tell them apart. But in Korean, and this is part of actually why one of the things that I found the most challenging when I started learning Korean, they don't give you that, so you have to sort of learn to distinguish it on your own. So that is the thing that you've got to watch out for. But when you learn to sort of tell those differences, and you're careful about making sure that you don't mistake a just native Korean suffix like for as in umak or parum or jabum or any of these others, then you're cool. And it's often very easy to tell them apart anyway. In Japanese, you don't have that problem, again, because you've got the characters right there. So, just to recap, for learners of both Japanese and Korean, you can really speed up your vocabulary learning just by paying attention to the Chinese characters that Chinese loanwords like parum, hatsuon, are composed of, and learning what those mean, and keeping your eyes open and your feelers out for any other time that you see those same syllables. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been helpful. This is Elise from Things Polyglots Know, TPK. If you like this content and you want to see more of it, please remember to like and subscribe. And if you want to contribute to this, then you can always find me at my Patreon, the link for which is showing up right here. 皆さん、ありがとうございます。감사합니다.